Hi everybody, Jim Sammons here. Relay a story to you about, well, in 1996. I hooked into my very first marlin. Did that here in San Diego. That fish dragged me 8 miles straight offshore. A fight I will never ever forget. Once we were out there 8 miles, my buddy and I were talking. It's like, you know what? If we ran into any trouble out here, we would have no way to contact anybody. Again, this was over 20 years ago. The very next day, I went out and bought my first VHF radio from Standard Horizon. And I've been using Standard Horizon radios ever since. This is a very, very old one. They've come a long way. VHF radios can be very basic, say like this one, or they can be much more complicated, like this one, full of features with distress calling, GPS navigation, the whole bit. So the main thing is having a VHF radio. So I'm going to go over some of the basics involved in VHF radios. So first off, why should you carry a VHF radio? Well, again, it's going to get you help from other boaters on the water rather than having to get on a cell phone and call into land and then try to, organize something. You will be able to get help from other boaters on the water. Also, they're just a fun tool to have with you for communicating with your buddies. I mean, there's many a times when we'll be out looking for live bait, and if it's really hard to find, we'll send everybody off in different directions looking for that live bait. Once you find some, you call your buddies over and you help each other out. So it's a great communication tool. It's a great safety tool. So if you're in the market for a VHF radio, some things you want to consider. Most importantly to me is that it is waterproof and that it floats. It doesn't do you any good if it's waterproof and doesn't float if you drop it. So a nice radio that's waterproof and floats. Another thing you like to consider is the power rating. They will come from 1 watt to 6 watts, generally speaking. If a radio has multiple settings, so I can broadcast at 1 watt, when I've got my buddies are all fairly close, and so we don't need to use a whole lot of power. Your battery's going to last longer. Do the 1 watt or 2 watt, and then if I, in an emergency type situation where I really need to broadcast farther, I can jump it up to the 6 watt. So you have that variable setting. So that's definitely something you want to look at in a radio if it's got the power. Because these things, it's got a very short antenna, and they are line of sight. You're not going off a satellite or anything like this. These are straight line of sight. So it's not going to broadcast over a mountain or anything like that, generally speaking. So, the stronger it is, the better your chance to reach somebody far away, particularly when you're very low to the water, like we are in kayaks. So I'm going to go over some of the basic operations and features on one of the more basic radios here. And this is the Standard Horizon HX300. It is floating. It is waterproof. So first off, you have your hailing or emergency channels. And those are channels 16 and 9. 9 being the straight hailing channel, 16 being the one that most boats monitor, and that is your hailing and emergency channel. And so what does that mean? That basically means that if I've got a buddy out on the water, or somebody I know who may be on the water, or I am in an emergency, I go to channel 16, and most radios will have a button on the front that says 16 or 9, so I'll hit that and it'll automatically go to 16. And I can say, hey, this is Jim, Bob, are you on the water today? Once he says yes, he should say, yes, let's go to channel 71, or let's go to channel 72, or whatever the case may be. 16 and 9 are strictly for hailing. You don't do radio checks. I hear more people get yelled at by the Coast Guard for using channel 16 for radio checks. So if you're doing a radio check, go to a channel that there's people on and do your radio check there. Don't do a radio check on 16 or 9. They are strictly for hailing, and then you switch to another channel. When you are making a broadcast, you want to hold down the PPT button, push to talk. You want to hold it. Quite often people will push the button and then let go, or they'll let go too soon. So I generally say wait a second before you start talking after you push the button, and then hold it for a second after you stop talking. That way you know your full message is going out there, because it sucks when somebody you get half of their message. One of the other buttons you will see on the front of the radio is the weather button. Most of these decent radios will have a weather channel, so you can go to that, and there's a 24/7 broadcast of the offshore weather. And you just hit that, and it's going to give you the weather.
Wind waves 2 feet or less. Swell west 2 to 4 feet. Sunday, wind variable less than 10 knots. Wind waves
So as you're rigging up in the morning, you could have that going so you know what the coming weather is. Another button that you should know about is the high-low button, which I was telling you, you can go from one broadcast to another. And these are kind of general statements. Every radio is going to have a different way of doing it. This one has it right on the front. It has the high-low. So I would just, well, I got to get out of weather, go to my presets, and it's just a matter of high-low. Some will have an HML showing, depending if you're on high, medium, or low power. This particular radio just has an L. So if there's nothing showing, you're on high, because that's the default. If an L is showing, you are on low. So again, all radios are different, but high, low. Another important thing to know is, where is the lock button? Because if you have this thing in your PFD, it's easy to bump against it and accidentally change channels. If you and your buddies have agreed to be on a certain channel, say, you know, where you're communicating on channel 71, it's nice to just lock it onto that channel so you don't accidentally bump it, change channels, and then they're calling you and you don't hear them. So having that lock button is a good one. You also need to know how to adjust the squelch, and squelch is basically a filter, a noise filter, and you will hear it. Let me get on squelch. So that is static, that is noise. So you generally adjust it till the noise stops. And that's where you want to be on the squelch. And it's just basically, again, it's a noise filter. The higher you push that filter up, the less you are going to hear weaker signals. So you want it in that low, the squelch in a lower range, so you get the low signals, but you eliminate the noise. Most radios are going to have a scan or a memory button or a preset button. So for instance, this radio has a preset. I can go into the preset, and then if I'm scrolling, I can scroll through the channels that I had preset. So if I tend to use 18, 69, 71, 72, 18, or whatever the case may be, I can scroll through those channels rather than having to scroll all the way, you know, through every single number, and I can just go through those. The other thing that you will have is a scan. So what that will do, if I hit scan, it scrolls through all of my presets, and I can lock that. So I am on scan, I'm scanning through all of my presets. So if I've got several buddies, we all use different channels, and then I also want to be monitoring 16, I just put it on scan through my presets, and it's going to hit every one of those. So if anybody broadcasts on any of those channels, I am going to hear it. For me, one of the features that I like on a handheld VHF radio is to have a speaker mic. And it needs to be a waterproof speaker mic as well. But that way I can keep the radio in the pocket of my PFD, and I will attach the speaker mic up here on my shoulder, so I never have to pull this thing out. I can just lean over and use the mic. And so, like I said, it's a speaker mic, so you'll hear it better, it's closer to my ear, and it's just much more convenient. So that's some of the very basics of using a handheld VHF radio. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give us that thumbs up. If you have any questions, throw them into the comment section down below. Remember, please always wear your PFD, and I look forward to seeing you on the water.